The year was 1983, and deep in the frozen forests of Ukraine, a Soviet freight train came to a sudden stop. Not because of mechanical failure, not because of ice on the tracks, but because something was hovering above the rails ahead. Something that shouldn't have existed. Something that would be buried in classified files for decades. Tonight we're diving into the secret archives of the Soviet Union. Files that were never meant to see daylight. Stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about the Cold War. Because while the world was focused on nuclear missiles and political tensions, something else was happening in the shadows. Something that both superpowers were desperately trying to understand and control. Welcome to a different kind of bedtime story. One where the monsters under the bed might actually be real, and the governments sworn to protect us were the ones keeping the lights off. This is the story of Soviet UFO encounters, classified military investigations, and the secrets that were buried so deep. Even the KGB pretended they didn't exist. But before we begin this journey into the unknown, I need you to understand something. These aren't the wild tales of conspiracy theorists or the fabrications of science fiction writers. These are official reports, documented encounters, and testimonies from trained military personnel who risked everything to speak the truth. Men and women who saw things that defied physics, challenged reality, and changed their lives forever. So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for stories that will make you question what's really out there in the darkness above us. Stories that suggest we've never been alone, and that the truth has been hiding in plain sight all along. The Soviet Union was a nation built on secrets. From the gulags to the nuclear program, from space exploration to military technology, everything operated behind a veil of classification and control. But there was one category of secrets that even the most hardened KGB operatives whispered about in hushed tones. Files marked with classifications so obscure that most officials never saw them. Reports of encounters with objects that moved in ways no human technology could explain. Picture this. It's the height of the Cold War. The world stands on the brink of nuclear annihilation. Both superpowers are racing to develop the most advanced weapons, the fastest aircraft, the most sophisticated surveillance systems. And yet, in the midst of this technological arms race, both sides are encountering something that makes their most advanced creations look like Stone Age tools. The difference was how they handled it. While the Americans would eventually create Project Blue Book and other public programs to investigate UFO sightings, the Soviets took a different approach. They buried everything. Deep, so deep that even today, decades after the fall of the Soviet Union, we're still uncovering files that reveal just how extensive their encounters really were. But why the secrecy? Why bury something that could revolutionize human understanding of technology and our place in the universe? The answer lies in the very nature of the Soviet system. Control was everything. The state controlled information, controlled narrative, controlled reality itself. And UFOs represented something that couldn't be controlled, couldn't be explained, couldn't be weaponized, or understood through conventional means. Imagine being a Soviet radar operator, trained to detect incoming American bombers or missiles, suddenly faced with objects that appear and disappear at will, that move faster than anything in your arsenal, that seem to mock the very laws of physics your entire defense system is built upon. What do you report? How do you explain to your superiors that something just made your multi-million ruble defense network look like a child's toy? The answer was simple. You didn't. You filed it under atmospheric anomaly, equipment malfunction, or weather balloon. And if the evidence was too compelling to dismiss, it disappeared into files so classified that acknowledging their existence would end your career, or worse. But some stories are too extraordinary to stay buried forever. Some witnesses are too credible to silence permanently. And some encounters leave traces that no amount of classification can erase. Take the case of Lieutenant Colonel Victor Shallon, a decorated officer with 30 years of service, responsible for monitoring Soviet airspace west of Moscow. On a clear July night in 1978, His radar screens lit up with 5 objects moving in formation over restricted airspace. Objects that shouldn't have been there. Objects that moved in ways that violated everything he knew about aviation and physics. The objects appeared suddenly, arranged themselves in a perfect triangle, then began contracting inward like a closing fist. One contact froze in mid-air at 12,000 meters, its speed dropping to absolute zero. Seconds later, another return vanished from the display completely. Not fading, not flying off, just gone. Shalon ordered a system refresh. The targets reappeared further south, descending in a pulsing pattern, moving down in steps, pausing at intervals like a cosmic elevator making stops. Nothing in his training, nothing in his experience, nothing in Soviet aviation technology could explain what he was witnessing. Within minutes, MiG-25's interceptors were scrambled from a nearby airbase. The pilots climbed quickly into the sector, directed by radar. But as they closed in on the targets, something impossible happened. The objects began moving again, only faster. Each burst of movement covered several kilometers in under a second. The tracking systems logged velocities approaching Mach 2, but without any Doppler distortion typically associated with high-speed flight. The pilots reported partial contact on their instruments, but nothing visual. They circled, they climbed, they searched the sky with their eyes and their senses, but there was nothing to see. Only the instruments insisted something was there, mocking them with ghost signals and impossible readings. Then, just before midnight, all 5 contacts disappeared simultaneously. No trailing echoes, no directional vectors, just empty screens where moments before had been the most advanced objects ever detected in Soviet airspace. Shalon removed his headset and gave a quiet order to archive all tapes, printouts, and logs. Within hours, men in dark coats arrived with sealed orders from Moscow. The radar facility was placed under lockdown. All evidence was confiscated. Personnel were separated and questioned. Shalon found himself in a windowless room, facing men who showed no identification, but asked questions with the precision of investigators who already knew the answers. Had the objects acted in coordination? Had they responded to radar sweeps? Had there been any physical symptoms during the encounter? He answered truthfully, professionally. The objects had behaved with clear intelligence, seeming to anticipate and counter every move the interceptors made. When the session ended, Shalon was told his radar command career was over. He would be reassigned to a desk job and instructed never to speak of what he'd witnessed. The official explanation was filed under atmospheric interference, caused by ionospheric scattering and thermal inversion. But there had been no thermal inversion that night. The weather had been stable, and civilian weather monitoring had recorded no anomalies in the upper atmosphere. Still, the classifications stuck. The files were sealed. The witnesses were reassigned or discharged, and officially nothing had happened in Soviet airspace that July night in 1978. But Shalon never forgot. None of them did, because once you've seen something that shouldn't exist, that moves beyond the boundaries of known physics, that responds to your actions with an intelligence you can't comprehend, it changes you. It leaves you with questions that no amount of classification can silence. And Shalon's encounter was just one of hundreds. Across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea, from the forests of Siberia to the deserts of Central Asia, similar events were being reported, investigated, and buried. Each one filed away under different classifications, different explanations, different lies designed to maintain the illusion of control. But the truth has a way of surfacing, even from the deepest archives. Documents get declassified, witnesses retire and start talking, and eventually, the stories begin to emerge. Stories of trains stopped by hovering lights, of military bases visited by silent craft, of pilots chasing objects that made their fastest jets look like they were standing still. These weren't the fevered imaginings of Cold War paranoia. These were encounters documented by the most professional, most trained, most skeptical observers in the Soviet system. Men and women whose job it was to distinguish between threats and illusions, between enemy aircraft and atmospheric phenomena, between reality and deception. And what they reported defied every category, every explanation, every comfortable assumption about humanity's place in the universe. The question isn't whether these encounters happened. The documentation is too extensive, the witnesses too credible, the cover-up too systematic to dismiss. The question is what they encountered, and why both superpowers worked so hard to keep it secret. Was it fear of mass panic, concern about technological disadvantage, worry that acknowledging these phenomena would undermine the very foundations of state power? Or was there something else, something deeper, something that threatened not just military secrets, but the entire world view upon which modern civilization was built? As we journey deeper into these classified files, as we hear from the witnesses who risked everything to preserve the truth, one thing becomes clear. The Cold War wasn't just about competing ideologies or nuclear weapons. It was about humanity's first systematic encounter with intelligence that didn't originate on Earth. And both sides, despite their differences, made the same choice. Bury it, classify it, pretend it never happened. Because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting that all their weapons, all their technology, all their carefully constructed systems of control were suddenly obsolete. The universe, it seemed, had other inhabitants, and they were watching. The files started surfacing in the late 1980s, just as the Soviet Union began its final collapse. Boxes of documents marked with classifications so obscure that even seasoned archivists had never seen them before. Papers that should have been destroyed decades earlier, but somehow survived in the chaos of a disintegrating empire. Among these documents was a report that would change everything we thought we knew about Soviet UFO encounters. It wasn't written by a military officer or intelligence operative. It was written by Dr. Yuri Petrov, a physicist working at a classified research facility deep in the Ural Mountains. And what he documented in the winter of 1979 would haunt the Soviet scientific establishment for decades. The facility was known only by its designation, Closed City 47. It didn't appear on any maps, had no official address, and its very existence was classified at the highest levels. Dr. Petrov had been working there for 15 years, developing advanced radar systems for the Soviet military. He was used to secrecy, used to working with technology that wouldn't be declassified for decades. But nothing had prepared him for what happened on the night of December 15th, 1979. It started with a power failure, not unusual in the remote facility, especially during the harsh Siberian winter. The backup generators kicked in immediately, but something was wrong. The electromagnetic readings were off the charts, showing disturbances unlike anything in their databases. Dr. Petrov and his team rushed to the observation deck to investigate. What they saw defied every principle of physics they had ever learned. Hovering approximately 200 meters above the facility was a structure that seemed to bend light around itself. Not invisible, but somehow difficult to focus on, as if the eye couldn't quite process what it was seeing. The object was massive, roughly the size of a football stadium, and it emitted a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through their bones. But the truly impossible part wasn't the object itself. It was what happened to time around it. Dr. Petrov's team had synchronized chronometers, standard procedure for any scientific observation. But as they watched the object, they noticed something extraordinary. The chronometers near the windows, closest to the phenomenon, were running slower than those deeper inside the building. Not by much, but measurably, consistently, impossibly. According to Einstein's theories, such time dilation should only occur near objects of immense gravitational mass, like black holes or neutron stars. But this object, whatever it was, seemed to be generating the same effect through means completely unknown to human science. Dr. Petrov immediately began documenting everything: electromagnetic readings, gravitational measurements, photographic evidence, testimonies from all 12 witnesses. He knew this was the discovery of the century, perhaps the millennium. Evidence of technology so advanced it made their most sophisticated equipment look primitive by comparison. The object remained for exactly 43 minutes. During that time, it performed maneuvers that violated every law of motion and energy conservation. It rotated without angular momentum, accelerated without visible propulsion, and at one point seemed to phase partially out of visible reality before snapping back into full materialization. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, it was gone. No gradual departure, no visible acceleration. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't, leaving only the gradually normalizing electromagnetic readings and the stunned silence of witnesses whose understanding of reality had just been shattered. Dr. Petrov worked through the night, compiling his report. 47 pages of detailed scientific analysis, complete with photographs, instrument readings, and theoretical implications. He submitted it through proper channels, marking it with the highest classification levels available. 3 days later, men from Moscow arrived at Closed City 47. They weren't scientists or military investigators. They were from Department 5 of the KGB, the division that handled the most sensitive state secrets. Dr. Petrov was escorted to an unmarked building in the city center and questioned for 18 hours straight. They didn't ask about what he had seen. They asked about what he had written, who he had talked to, and what he planned to do with his findings. When the interrogation ended, Dr. Petrov was presented with a new report to sign. This one described a malfunction in the facility's experimental radar array, which had caused unusual electromagnetic readings and optical illusions among the staff. He refused to sign. The next day, he was transferred to a teaching position at a minor university in Kazakhstan. His security clearance was revoked, his research confiscated, and his name removed from all official records of the Closed City 47 project. As far as the Soviet government was concerned, Dr. Yuri Petrov had never worked on classified research, had never witnessed anything unusual, and certainly had never filed a report about impossible technology hovering over a secret facility. But bureaucrats make mistakes, and totalitarian systems aren't as thorough as they pretend to be. Dr. Petrov had kept a copy of his original report, hidden in a safety deposit box in a Moscow bank under his wife's maiden name. When the Soviet Union collapsed, when the KGB files were scattered and the classification systems crumbled, that report found its way to researchers studying the hidden history of Soviet UFO encounters. What they discovered was more than just one scientist's incredible experience. Dr. Petrov's report contained references to other incidents, other facilities, other witnesses whose stories had been similarly buried. He had been part of an informal network of Soviet scientists and military personnel who had encountered these phenomena and tried to study them, only to be silenced by a system that couldn't tolerate the implications of what they had found. The network called itself the Circle of Silence, and its members communicated through coded letters and carefully arranged meetings in public places. They shared data, compared notes, and tried to piece together a picture of what was happening in Soviet airspace that their government refused to acknowledge. What they discovered was staggering. The encounters weren't random. They weren't isolated incidents or misidentified weather phenomena. They followed patterns, showed intelligence, and seemed to focus on specific types of military and scientific installations. Nuclear facilities, radar stations, missile bases, research laboratories. Places where humanity's most advanced technology was being developed and deployed. It was as if something was conducting a systematic survey of Soviet capabilities, studying their defenses, evaluating their technological progress. And the most disturbing part was how easily these unknown craft penetrated the most secure airspace in the world, operated with impunity over the most classified facilities, and departed without leaving any trace that official channels would acknowledge. The Circle of Silence documented dozens of such encounters. A nuclear submarine base on the White Sea, visited by objects that descended directly from space and hovered motionless above the most sensitive installations. A missile testing facility in Kazakhstan, where launches were repeatedly delayed due to unexplained electromagnetic interference that coincided with visual sightings of unknown craft. A radar station in the Arctic that tracked objects moving at speeds that should have torn them apart, yet showed no signs of atmospheric heating or sonic booms. Each incident was investigated, classified, and buried. Each witness was questioned, reassigned, or silenced. Each report was filed away in archives so secure that acknowledging their existence would violate state security laws. But the Circle of Silence persisted, operating in the shadows of a system that demanded absolute control over information. They met in metro stations, exchanged data in park benches, and communicated through chess moves in newspaper puzzles. They were scientists, engineers, military officers, and intelligence analysts who couldn't reconcile their training with what they had witnessed. Dr. Petrov became their unofficial coordinator, using his academic position to travel between cities and maintain contact with the network. He collected reports, analyzed patterns, and slowly began to construct a comprehensive picture of the phenomenon that was visiting Soviet airspace with increasing frequency. What emerged was deeply unsettling. The encounters weren't random visitors or atmospheric anomalies. They showed clear signs of intelligence, purpose, and technological capability that exceeded anything in human arsenals. More importantly, they seemed to be escalating, becoming more frequent and more bold in their surveillance of Soviet military assets. By 1985, Dr. Petrov had documented over 200 separate incidents across the Soviet Union, each one investigated by local authorities, each one explained away through official channels, each one adding to a pattern that suggested humanity was being systematically studied by intelligence that didn't originate on Earth. The question that haunted the Circle of Silence wasn't whether these encounters were real. The evidence was too extensive, the witnesses too credible, the documentation too detailed to dismiss. The question was why their government was working so hard to keep it secret, and what that secrecy might ultimately cost humanity. Because if these objects represented technology from another civilization, then the Cold War suddenly seemed like a trivial dispute between children playing with dangerous toys. And if that technology was as advanced as it appeared, then both superpowers were facing a reality that made their nuclear arsenals and space programs look like elaborate exercises in futility. The universe, it seemed, already had occupants who possessed capabilities that human science could barely comprehend, and they were watching, studying, evaluating humanity with the detached interest of researchers observing laboratory specimens. The only question remaining was what they planned to do with what they learned. The breakthrough came in 1987, when a single document changed everything the Circle of Silence thought they knew about Soviet UFO policy. It wasn't found in any official archive or leaked by a sympathetic bureaucrat. It was discovered by accident, tucked inside the binding of an unrelated technical manual that Dr. Petrov had purchased from a black market dealer in scientific equipment. The document was a memorandum, dated March 1962, addressed to the Politburo from the head of the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. Its classification was so high that most members of the Politburo would never have been authorized to see it, and its contents revealed that the Soviet leadership hadn't just known about the UFO encounters, they had been actively preparing for them. The memo outlined something called Protocol 7, a comprehensive response plan for what it termed non-terrestrial contact scenarios. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, but the implications were staggering. The Soviet government had been planning for contact with extraterrestrial intelligence since at least the early 1960s, decades before most of the encounters documented by the Circle of Silence. Protocol 7 detailed everything from communication procedures to containment strategies, from scientific analysis protocols to public information management. It established a chain of command that bypassed normal military and intelligence hierarchies, creating a shadow organization within the Soviet system specifically designed to handle encounters with advanced non-human technology. Most chilling was Section 5 of the protocol, which dealt with what it called preservation of state stability. The section outlined detailed plans for suppressing information about extraterrestrial contact, including the systematic discrediting of witnesses, the confiscation and destruction of evidence, and the creation of false explanations for encounters that couldn't be completely covered up. Reading this document, Dr. Petrov finally understood why every report filed by the Circle of Silence had been buried, why every witness had been silenced, why every piece of evidence had disappeared into classified archives. It wasn't incompetence or bureaucratic indifference. It was policy, implemented at the highest levels of government and carried out with the precision of a military operation. The Soviet Union hadn't been ignoring the UFO phenomenon. They had been managing it, controlling it, weaponizing the secrecy around it to maintain social order and political stability, because acknowledging the reality of advanced extraterrestrial visitation would undermine the fundamental assumptions upon which Soviet power was built. If there were beings with technology that made human civilization look primitive, then what did that say about Marxist theories of historical progression? If there were intelligences that could travel between stars while humanity struggled to reach the moon, then what relevance did earthly political systems have? If the universe contained civilizations millions of years more advanced than humans, then the entire framework of Soviet ideology became meaningless. But Protocol 7 revealed something even more disturbing than systematic cover-up. It contained references to something called the Acquisition Program, a classified project aimed at recovering and reverse engineering extraterrestrial technology. The memo mentioned facilities in remote locations, teams of scientists working on retrieved materials, and research into propulsion systems that operated on principles unknown to human science. Dr. Petrov shared this discovery with his network, and the response was immediate and electric. Suddenly, the pieces began falling into place. The unusual construction projects in remote areas that were explained as agricultural facilities, the recruitment of theoretical physicists for projects they couldn't discuss, the massive budgets allocated to research programs that produced no published results. The Soviet Union hadn't just been covering up UFO encounters. They had been collecting them, studying them, and attempting to unlock the technological secrets that could give them an insurmountable advantage in the Cold War. One member of the Circle of Silence, a former radar technician named Pavel Volkov, came forward with information that seemed to confirm this theory. In 1974, he had been stationed at a facility in the Kamchatka Peninsula when a UFO had crashed during a severe thunderstorm. The object had been recovered by special teams that arrived within hours, as if they had been waiting for exactly such an opportunity. Volkov described seeing the wreckage loaded onto unmarked trucks and transported to a heavily guarded compound deeper in the wilderness. He was debriefed by men who showed no identification, but asked detailed questions about the crash site, the object's trajectory, and any unusual electromagnetic readings recorded before impact. 3 days later, Volkov was transferred to a weather station in the Arctic, where he spent the remaining 2 years of his military service monitoring atmospheric conditions and filing reports that no one ever read. He never spoke about what he had witnessed until Dr. Petrov contacted him through the Circle of Silence network. But Volkov's story wasn't unique. As word spread through the network, other witnesses came forward with similar accounts. A helicopter pilot who had transported scientific teams to crash sites. An army engineer who had helped construct underground facilities that were explained as civil defense bunkers, but seemed designed for entirely different purposes. A physicist who had been recruited for a project involving exotic materials with properties that violated known laws of physics. Each witness had been sworn to secrecy, threatened with prosecution for treason if they spoke about their experiences. Each had been reassigned to remote postings or early retirement. Each had carried their secrets for decades, believing they were alone in their knowledge. Together, their testimonies painted a picture of a vast, coordinated program spanning decades and involving thousands of personnel. The Soviet Union had been systematically recovering extraterrestrial technology, reverse engineering it, and attempting to integrate it into their military and space programs. The implications were staggering. If the Soviets had been successful in understanding even a fraction of this technology, it could explain some of the seemingly impossible advances they had made in certain areas. Their early success in space exploration, their development of advanced radar systems, their progress in theoretical physics research that seemed to leap ahead of Western understanding. But it also raised disturbing questions about what they might have discovered, what they might have learned from studying technology that operated on principles beyond human comprehension, and what they might have been planning to do with that knowledge. Dr. Petrov began to suspect that the UFO encounters documented by the Circle of Silence weren't just random visitations or scientific curiosity from extraterrestrial observers. They might have been retrieval missions, attempts by the original owners of crashed technology to recover their property. The increasing frequency and boldness of the encounters might have been a response to Soviet attempts to weaponize extraterrestrial technology. The thought kept him awake at night. What if humanity had stumbled into a cosmic conflict without understanding the stakes? What if the Cold War was just a minor skirmish in a much larger struggle between civilizations separated by millions of years of technological development? The evidence was fragmentary, circumstantial, but increasingly compelling. Documents that reference projects with no official existence, witnesses who describe technology that shouldn't have been possible with human science, facilities that consumed enormous resources but produced no visible results, and underlying it all, the systematic suppression of information that suggested both superpowers were aware of something that made their nuclear arsenals look like Stone Age tools, something that could render their entire military-industrial complexes obsolete overnight. The Circle of Silence had started as an informal network of scientists and military personnel sharing puzzling experiences. But as their investigation deepened, as the patterns became clearer, they began to realize they had uncovered something far more significant than isolated UFO encounters. They had discovered evidence of humanity's first contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, and the systematic cover-up of that contact by governments too terrified of the implications to acknowledge what was happening above their heads every night. The question was no longer whether extraterrestrial visitation was real. The question was what humanity's leaders planned to do about it, and whether their decisions would ultimately save or doom the species they claimed to protect. Because somewhere in the classified archives of both superpowers, in facilities that didn't officially exist, teams of scientists were working with technology that could revolutionize human civilization or destroy it completely. And the beings who had originally created that technology were still out there, watching, waiting, and perhaps growing increasingly concerned about how their gifts were being used. The Cold War had always been about the balance of power between two nuclear-armed civilizations, but now it seemed that both sides were playing a game whose rules had been written by intelligences they couldn't understand, using technology they couldn't control, in service of goals they couldn't comprehend. And the stakes weren't just the fate of human civilization, they were the survival of Earth itself. The year 1989 changed everything. Not just because of the Berlin Wall falling or the Soviet Union beginning its collapse, but because of what happened in a small archive in Leningrad when a junior clerk named Mikhail Kozlov made a discovery that would rewrite our understanding of the entire Cold War. Kozlov was processing boxes of documents scheduled for destruction as part of the systematic dismantling of Soviet bureaucracy. Most of it was routine paperwork, budget reports, personnel files from facilities that were being closed down. But buried in Box 247C, between mundane requisition forms and maintenance schedules, was a folder marked with symbols he'd never seen before. The classification markings weren't in any system taught in government training programs. The paper itself felt different, heavier, with a texture that seemed almost organic. And when Kozlov opened the folder, what he found inside challenged everything he thought he knew about his government's capabilities and intentions. The folder contained photographs, not surveillance photos or military reconnaissance images, but something far more extraordinary. Clear, detailed pictures of craft that looked like nothing in any aircraft manual. Sleek, seamless objects with surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Vehicles with no visible engines, no control surfaces, no means of propulsion that human engineering could explain. But these weren't blurry, distant shots taken by amateur observers. These were high-resolution technical photographs, taken from multiple angles, with rulers and measurement devices visible in the frame. Professional documentation of objects that were clearly being studied in controlled environments. Each photograph was labelled with location codes, date stamps, and technical specifications. The dates ranged from 1953 to 1987, suggesting a systematic collection program spanning more than 3 decades. The locations were coordinates corresponding to remote facilities across the Soviet Union, many of which Kozlov recognized as classified research installations. Most disturbing were the technical specifications. Measurements of electromagnetic output that exceeded anything in Soviet databases. Material composition analyses that listed elements not found on Earth. Propulsion system evaluations that described technology operating on principles that violated known laws of physics. This wasn't theoretical research or speculative science fiction. These were engineering reports on actual craft that had been recovered, studied, and apparently reverse-engineered by Soviet scientists working in facilities so secret that most government officials didn't know they existed. Kozlov's hands trembled as he turned through page after page of documentation. Detailed schematics showing internal structures that made no engineering sense. Metallurgical reports describing materials with properties that should have been impossible. Energy output readings that suggested power sources more efficient than anything human technology had achieved. But the most chilling discovery came near the end of the folder. A memorandum dated December 1987, addressed to the General Secretary himself. The subject line was simple but terrifying: Project Synthesis, Final Phase Authorization. The memo was brief, written in the clinical language of bureaucracy, but its implications were staggering. It described a program to integrate recovered extraterrestrial technology into Soviet military systems. Not just study it or understand it, but weaponize it. Turn it into tools of war that could give the Soviet Union absolute dominance over any terrestrial opponent. The memo referenced successful integration of exotic propulsion systems into experimental aircraft, the development of directed energy weapons based on recovered technology, and the creation of defensive systems that could neutralize nuclear weapons through means the West couldn't understand or counter. Reading this document, Kozlov realized he was looking at evidence of humanity's first attempt to weaponize extraterrestrial technology. The Soviet Union hadn't just been covering up UFO encounters or studying crashed vehicles. They had been building a secret arsenal based on science that was literally out of this world. The implications were terrifying. If the Soviets had successfully integrated this technology, if they had created weapons based on principles beyond human understanding, then the entire balance of the Cold War was an illusion. Nuclear deterrence became meaningless when one side possessed technology that could neutralize nuclear weapons or deliver strikes through means no defense system could detect or counter. But there was something else in the folder that made Kozlov's blood run cold. A series of photographs showing not just the craft, but their occupants. Beings that were clearly not human, preserved in what appeared to be cryogenic storage facilities. The images were clinical, scientific, but undeniably real. Small humanoid figures with enlarged craniums and elongated limbs. Facial features that were recognizably intelligent but utterly alien. Bodies that showed signs of advanced surgical intervention, as if Soviet scientists had been conducting detailed anatomical studies. Each photograph was labeled with technical data: height, weight, organ function, neurological activity. The beings weren't just preserved specimens. According to the data, some had been alive when recovered, had been studied while conscious, had possibly even communicated with their captors. The thought made Kozlov physically ill. His government, the system he had served faithfully for 15 years, had not only recovered extraterrestrial visitors, but had been conducting experiments on living beings whose only crime was visiting Earth. They had turned first contact into first torture, scientific curiosity into systematic brutality. But as he continued reading, an even more disturbing picture emerged. The experiments weren't just about understanding alien physiology, they were attempts at communication, at extracting information about extraterrestrial technology and civilization. The Soviet Union had been interrogating beings from other worlds, trying to extract the secrets of their science and technology. Some of the documents suggested they had been partially successful. References to cognitive interface protocols and technological knowledge transfer implied that the Soviet scientists had found ways to communicate with their captives, to learn from them, to acquire information that no human civilization should have possessed. The final document in the folder was the most chilling of all. A report dated January 1988, just 1 year before Kozlov found it, describing what was termed a containment breach. The clinical language couldn't hide the horror of what had happened. The extraterrestrial beings held in Soviet facilities had somehow communicated with others of their kind. And those others had responded. The report described a coordinated series of incidents across multiple facilities. Simultaneous power failures, electromagnetic disruptions, and the complete disappearance of all extraterrestrial materials and beings held in Soviet custody. Not escaped, disappeared. As if they had simply been teleported away by technology the Soviets couldn't understand or prevent. The aftermath had been catastrophic for the secret program. Without the source materials, without the beings to study, the entire project had collapsed overnight. Decades of research became useless. Weapons systems based on incompletely understood technology began failing. The Soviet Union's secret advantage in the Cold War evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. But the beings had left behind something more terrifying than any weapon. A message transmitted through every electronic system in every facility simultaneously. Not in Russian or any human language, but somehow understood by every person who received it. The message was simple, direct, and utterly terrifying. Your species has chosen hostility. This choice will be remembered. Reading this final document, Kozlov understood why the Soviet system was collapsing. It wasn't just economic failure or political pressure. His government had made first contact with an extraterrestrial civilization and had chosen to respond with violence, experimentation, and attempted exploitation. And that civilization had withdrawn its technology, its knowledge, and its tolerance for human aggression. The Cold War hadn't ended because of political changes or economic collapse. It had ended because humanity had revealed itself to be too dangerous, too primitive, too hostile to be trusted with the secrets of the universe. The extraterrestrial observers had given humans a test, and humanity had failed catastrophically. Kozlov sat in the archive room for hours, staring at the documents that revealed the hidden history of his species' first contact with intelligence from beyond Earth. The official narratives, the political explanations, the historical analyses, all of it was fiction designed to hide the truth about humanity's cosmic failure. As he finally closed the folder and prepared to continue with his assigned task of destroying government documents, Kozlov made a decision that would change his life forever. Instead of feeding these papers into the incinerator, he carefully separated them from the other materials and hid them inside his coat. He couldn't let this evidence be destroyed. The world needed to know what had really happened during the Cold War, why it had really ended, and what humanity's future relationship with extraterrestrial intelligence might become. Because if the message was accurate, if the choice had indeed been remembered, then every person on Earth needed to understand the consequences of their government's decisions. Walking out of the archive building that evening, Kozlov carried with him proof that the Cold War had been humanity's first and most catastrophic failure in interstellar diplomacy. The nuclear standoff, the proxy wars, the technological competition, all of it had been theatre, performed while the real drama played out in secret facilities where humans tortured beings whose only mistake had been visiting a primitive and violent world. But he also carried something else. Hope that revealing the truth might somehow begin the process of redemption. Because if extraterrestrial intelligence was still watching, still evaluating humanity's worthiness for contact, then perhaps honesty about past failures might be the first step toward a different future. The documents would eventually make their way to researchers, journalists, and truth seekers around the world. They would be authenticated by experts, corroborated by other witnesses, and slowly integrated into humanity's understanding of its own hidden history. But in 1989, walking through the snowy streets of Leningrad with the weight of cosmic truth hidden beneath his winter coat, Mikhail Kozlov was simply a man who had seen too much and couldn't remain silent. A clerk who had stumbled upon evidence that the universe was far stranger, far more dangerous, and far more unforgiving than anyone had imagined. The Cold War was over, but humanity's real test was just beginning. Because somewhere among the stars, an intelligence that had offered knowledge and received hostility in return was still watching, still waiting, still remembering the choice that had been made in those secret facilities beneath the frozen earth. And the next move was entirely up to them. The network that Mikhail Kozlov inadvertently joined by preserving those documents was vast, secretive, and more dangerous than he could have imagined. Within weeks of smuggling the folder out of the archive, he found himself contacted by people he'd never met who seemed to know exactly what he'd discovered. They called themselves the Witnesses, and they had been waiting for someone like Kozlov for decades. Former military officers, retired scientists, ex-intelligence operatives who had all encountered fragments of the same massive secret. Each had preserved evidence, protected testimonies, and risked their lives to document what their governments had tried so hard to erase. Dr. Yuri Petrov had become their unofficial leader, using his academic connections to create a network that stretched across the former Soviet Union and into the West. What had started as the Circle of Silence had evolved into something far more ambitious, a systematic effort to reconstruct the complete history of human extraterrestrial contact and the government cover-ups that had followed. The evidence they had compiled was staggering. Not just the Soviet materials that Kozlov had preserved, but parallel documentation from American sources, British intelligence files, French military reports, and testimonies from witnesses in dozens of countries. The pattern was global, systematic, and undeniable. Every major government had encountered extraterrestrial intelligence. Everyone had made the same choice: secrecy, study, and attempted weaponization. And everyone had eventually lost access to the technology they had tried to exploit, usually after incidents that suggested the extraterrestrial observers had reached the limits of their patience with human aggression. The American files were particularly revealing. Documents that paralleled the Soviet research showed that both superpowers had been engaged in nearly identical programs, often studying identical technology recovered from crashes that seemed too convenient to be accidental. It was as if the extraterrestrial intelligence had been conducting a controlled experiment, providing both sides with similar resources and observing how humanity would respond. The response had been depressingly predictable. Instead of cooperation, competition. Instead of peaceful study, military applications. Instead of using the knowledge to benefit all humanity, both sides had tried to gain advantages that would allow them to dominate or destroy their terrestrial opponents. But the witnesses had discovered something that made the situation even more complex and disturbing. The extraterrestrial intelligence hadn't just been observing human behavior, they had been actively managing it. Crashes had occurred at precise locations and times that ensured recovery by specific military units. Technology had been left behind that was just advanced enough to intrigue human scientists, but not complete enough to be immediately useful. It was as if humanity had been participating in a carefully controlled test, with the extraterrestrial observers manipulating variables and recording results. The Cold War itself might have been partially orchestrated, a way of studying how a primitive species would behave when given access to power beyond their understanding. The implications were terrifying and humbling in equal measure. Humanity's greatest political conflict, the struggle that had defined the second half of the 20th century, might have been nothing more than a laboratory experiment conducted by intelligence so advanced that humans were essentially lab rats being studied for their reactions to stimuli. Dr. Petrov had been analyzing the patterns for years, and what he'd discovered suggested that the experiment had multiple phases. The initial contact period, when crash technology was provided to both sides. The development phase, when human scientists attempted to reverse engineer what they'd found. The application phase, when both superpowers tried to weaponize the technology. And finally, the withdrawal phase, when the extraterrestrial observers removed their technology and ended the experiment. The timing of the withdrawal corresponded almost exactly with the end of the Cold War, as if the extraterrestrial intelligence had concluded that humanity had failed the test and there was no point in continuing the observation. The message that had been transmitted to Soviet facilities, "Your species has chosen hostility. This choice will be remembered," wasn't just a warning. It was a final evaluation. But Dr. Petrov had discovered something else in the patterns, something that gave him both hope and deep concern. The experiment might not be over. The withdrawal of technology in the late 1980s might have been just the end of Phase 1. Recent sightings, encounters, and incidents suggested that Phase 2 was beginning. The new encounters were different, more open, less secretive, harder to cover up or explain away, as if the extraterrestrial observers had decided that humanity needed to be made aware of their presence, whether governments wanted that awareness or not. The age of secret contact was ending, and the age of public revelation was beginning. The evidence was everywhere for those who knew how to look for it. Military officials speaking openly about encounters that would have been classified for decades just years earlier. Government agencies releasing videos and documents that confirmed what witnesses had been saying for generations. Scientific institutions acknowledging the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence in ways that would have been career suicide in previous decades. It was as if a dam was breaking, and decades of suppressed information were finally being allowed to flow into public consciousness. But Dr. Petrov suspected this wasn't happening by accident or because of changing political attitudes. It was happening because the extraterrestrial intelligence had decided it was time for humanity to know the truth about their cosmic neighborhood. The question that haunted the witnesses was whether this revelation was preparation for something positive or something catastrophic. Were humans being prepared for open contact, for integration into a larger galactic community? Or were they being warned about consequences that would follow from their failures in the first phase of contact? The message that had been transmitted to Soviet facilities suggested the latter. Your species has chosen hostility. This choice will be remembered. It sounded less like a warning and more like a verdict. Humanity had been tested and found wanting. The revelation of extraterrestrial presence might not be preparation for contact, but preparation for judgment. Kozlov found himself at the center of discussions that would have seemed like science fiction just months earlier, but now felt like the most important conversations in human history. The documents he had preserved weren't just historical curiosities. They were evidence in a case that would determine humanity's future relationship with intelligence that spanned the cosmos. The witnesses had become more than just a network of people sharing unusual experiences. They had become humanity's unofficial defense team, preparing arguments for why the species deserved another chance despite its failures in first contact. They were collecting evidence of human progress, examples of cooperation and peaceful development, proof that the hostility displayed by governments didn't represent the true nature of human potential. But they were also preparing for the possibility that the verdict had already been reached, that the revelation of extraterrestrial presence was simply the first step in a process that would end with consequences no human government could prevent or mitigate. Because somewhere in the darkness between stars, intelligence that had watched humanity's first steps into space was making decisions about what those steps would ultimately be allowed to accomplish. And the evidence from those secret Cold War facilities suggested that the decision might not be in humanity's favor. The universe, it seemed, had standards for civilizations that wanted to join the cosmic community, and based on how humans had responded to their first taste of extraterrestrial technology, those standards might be higher than any earthly civilization could meet. As Kozlov looked up at the stars from his apartment window each night, he wondered if they were still watching, still evaluating, still remembering the choice that had been made in those underground facilities. And whether anything humans could do now would be enough to change a judgment that might already be written in the cosmic court records of a civilization older than human history. The Cold War was over, but humanity's real trial was just beginning. And the evidence suggested that the jury was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting to deliver a verdict that would echo through the ages. The revelation came in fragments, like pieces of a cosmic puzzle scattered across decades of classified documents. But as the witnesses assembled these fragments, a picture emerged that was more terrifying than any government cover-up or secret military program. The extraterrestrial intelligence that had been observing humanity wasn't just watching passively. They were documenting everything, creating a comprehensive record of human behavior that would determine the species' ultimate fate. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been analyzing electromagnetic signatures for the Spanish military when she stumbled upon the pattern. Hidden in routine atmospheric monitoring data from the 1970s and 1980s were subtle frequency modulations that didn't match any known natural or artificial sources. When she ran the data through advanced signal processing software that hadn't existed during the Cold War, the modulations resolved into something that made her question everything she thought she knew about Earth's place in the universe. The signals weren't random. They were structured, organized, clearly artificial, and they were everywhere. Embedded in radio transmissions, woven through satellite communications, threaded invisibly through the electromagnetic spectrum that surrounded the planet like a vast, invisible web. For decades, every human communication, every radar pulse, every electronic transmission had been quietly monitored and recorded by intelligence that operated on frequencies human technology couldn't detect. But these weren't just passive observations. The signals showed signs of active analysis, real-time processing, and systematic cataloging. As if everything humans said, everything they transmitted, everything they thought they were communicating privately was being fed into some vast cosmic database for evaluation and judgment. Dr. Vasquez brought her findings to Dr. Petrov's network, and the implications sent shockwaves through the witnesses' community. The extraterrestrial observers hadn't just been studying crash technology or monitoring military facilities. They had been recording human civilization itself, creating a comprehensive archive of the species' development, behavior, and moral choices. Every war, every peace treaty, every act of cooperation or aggression had been documented with scientific precision. Every advancement in technology, every breakthrough in science, every moment of human achievement or failure had been catalogued in files that existed somewhere beyond Earth's atmosphere. The monitoring had intensified during the Cold War, as if the extraterrestrial intelligence recognized that humanity was reaching a critical juncture in its development. The nuclear standoff, the space race, the technological competition between superpowers, all of it had been observed with the detached interest of scientists studying a species at a crucial evolutionary moment. But the most disturbing discovery was what had happened after the secret facilities were emptied in the late 1980s. The electromagnetic monitoring had continued, but its focus had shifted. Instead of concentrating on military installations and government communications, the surveillance had expanded to include civilian populations, commercial activities, and cultural developments. It was as if the extraterrestrial observers had concluded their evaluation of human governments and were now studying ordinary people to determine whether the species as a whole deserved the judgment their leaders had earned. Every internet search, every phone call, every digital transaction was being analysed for evidence of humanity's true nature. The implications were staggering. Privacy, as humans understood it, was an illusion. The entire species was living under observation so sophisticated that most people couldn't even detect it was happening. Every secret, every private moment, every intimate conversation was part of a vast data set being compiled by intelligence that viewed humans the way scientists might study bacteria in a petri dish. But Dr. Petrov had noticed something in the recent data that gave him both hope and deep concern. The monitoring patterns were changing again. The systematic surveillance that had characterized the post-Cold War period was being replaced by something more selective, more focused, as if the extraterrestrial intelligence had completed their general evaluation and were now concentrating on specific individuals, specific groups, specific activities. The selection criteria weren't random. The individuals being monitored most intensively included scientists working on consciousness research, philosophers studying ethics and moral development, artists creating works about humanity's place in the universe, and ordinary people who had demonstrated unusual capacity for empathy, cooperation, and peaceful conflict resolution. It was as if the extraterrestrial observers were compiling a different kind of database now. Not a record of humanity's failures, but an inventory of its potential for growth and redemption. The surveillance had become a search for evidence that the species might be capable of transcending the hostility and aggression that had characterized its first contact with cosmic intelligence. But this selective monitoring came with an ominous implication. If the extraterrestrial intelligence was identifying specific individuals and groups that represented humanity's better angels, what did that suggest about their plans for everyone else? Were they preparing to preserve the best examples of human potential while allowing the rest of the species to face the consequences of choices made by their governments decades earlier? The Witnesses Network had evolved from a group of people sharing unusual experiences to something resembling humanity's first extraterrestrial intelligence agency. They were no longer just documenting encounters and preserving evidence. They were trying to understand the mind of an intelligence so advanced that human civilization was just one of countless subjects in a vast cosmic study. Dr. Petrov had been analyzing the behavioral patterns embedded in the monitoring data, looking for clues about the observer's ultimate intentions. What he found suggested that humanity was being evaluated according to criteria that most humans had never even considered. Not just technological advancement or military capability, but emotional maturity, ethical development, and capacity for peaceful coexistence with other forms of consciousness. The extraterrestrial intelligence seemed to operate according to principles that viewed aggression and hostility as signs of primitive development, regardless of how sophisticated the technology used to express that aggression might be. From their perspective, a species that responded to contact with other intelligence through violence and exploitation had revealed fundamental character flaws that no amount of scientific advancement could overcome. But they also seemed to recognize that not all members of a species necessarily shared the characteristics displayed by their governments and military institutions. The selective monitoring suggested they understood that individual humans might transcend the limitations of their collective culture, that some members of the species might be capable of growth beyond the patterns that had defined first contact. The question that kept Dr. Petrov awake at night was whether that recognition would translate into mercy for the species as a whole, or simply result in a more discriminating form of judgment. Would humanity be given another chance based on the potential demonstrated by its best representatives, or would those representatives be preserved while the rest of the species faced consequences for choices they had never been consulted about? The electromagnetic monitoring data suggested that decision was approaching rapidly. The patterns had shifted again in recent months, becoming more intensive and focused, as if the evaluation period was ending and the extraterrestrial intelligence was preparing to implement whatever conclusion they had reached about humanity's fate. But there was something else in the data that gave Dr. Petrov a glimmer of hope. Embedded in the most recent monitoring signals were what appeared to be response protocols, communication frameworks designed to establish contact with the individuals and groups that had been identified as representing humanity's positive potential. It was as if the extraterrestrial intelligence had concluded their evaluation and were now preparing to make contact with selected humans who might be capable of representing the species in whatever came next. Not the governments that had failed the first test, not the military institutions that had chosen hostility over cooperation, but individuals who had demonstrated the capacity for growth, wisdom, and peaceful interaction with other forms of consciousness. The age of secret contact was ending, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of a mass revelation or public acknowledgement, the extraterrestrial intelligence appeared to be preparing for selective contact with humans who had proven themselves worthy of inclusion in whatever cosmic community existed beyond Earth's atmosphere. For the witnesses, this created both opportunity and terrible responsibility. They had become humanity's unofficial ambassadors to intelligence that spanned the stars, tasked with representing a species whose governments had already failed the most important test in human history. The documents that Kozlov had preserved, the testimonies that Dr. Petrov had collected, the evidence that the witnesses had assembled, all of it was now more than historical curiosity. It was humanity's record in a cosmic court case that would determine whether the species had any future beyond its own solar system. And somewhere in the darkness between worlds, intelligence that had been watching and evaluating for decades was preparing to render a verdict that would echo through the ages. The monitoring was ending, the evaluation was complete, and the next phase of human history was about to begin. Whether that phase would involve redemption or judgment depended on choices that were no longer being made in government facilities or military installations. They were being made by individuals who might never know they were representing their entire species in the most important negotiation in human history. The Cold War had been humanity's first test in cosmic diplomacy, and the species had failed catastrophically. But the electromagnetic monitoring data suggested that a second test was beginning, and this time the examiners weren't interested in what governments and military institutions would do. They wanted to know what individual humans were capable of when given the chance to transcend the limitations of their collective past. And the answer to that question would determine whether humanity had any future worth preserving in a universe populated by intelligence that had been watching, waiting, and remembering for far longer than human civilization had even existed. The stars were no longer distant points of light in the darkness. They were windows into a cosmic community that humanity might be invited to join, or from which they might be permanently excluded, and the invitation would be extended not to governments or institutions, but to individuals who had proven themselves capable of representing the species' potential for growth beyond the hostility and aggression that had defined first contact. The next chapter of human history was about to be written, not in the halls of power or the chambers of government, but in the hearts and minds of ordinary people who might be humanity's last hope for redemption in the eyes of intelligence that spanned the cosmos. And the clock was ticking, measured not in years or decades, but in electromagnetic pulses that carried messages between worlds about a species that had one last chance to prove it deserved a place among the stars. The transmission came on a frequency that shouldn't have existed. Dr. Sarah Chen was monitoring deep space communications from the Arecibo Observatory when her instruments detected something that made her question decades of scientific training. It wasn't the random background radiation of cosmic noise. It wasn't interference from terrestrial sources. It was structured, purposeful, and directed specifically at Earth. But this wasn't the kind of signal that SETI researchers had been hoping to discover for generations. This was something far more disturbing, a response to transmissions that had never been officially sent, acknowledgements of communications that existed only in the darkest corners of classified government archives. The signal was brief, lasting only 17 seconds, but those 17 seconds contained more information than human civilization had transmitted into space during its entire history. Compressed data streams that suggested technology capable of processing and analyzing electromagnetic communications on a scale that made Earth's most advanced computers look like pocket calculators. Dr. Chen had been part of the Witnesses Network for 3 years, ever since her husband had shared documents from his time as a radar technician at a facility that officially didn't exist. She knew about the monitoring, the evaluation, the systematic observation that had been ongoing for decades. But this was different. This was a response, a signal that suggested the evaluation period was ending and something new was beginning. The data structure was unlike anything in human information theory. Instead of linear sequences of binary code, the signal appeared to contain multidimensional information matrices that conveyed meaning through relationships between frequency modulations that existed in mathematical spaces. Human scientists were only beginning to understand. But when she fed the signal through quantum processing algorithms that the military had developed for analyzing extraterrestrial communications, fragments of meaning began to emerge. Not words or languages, but concepts transmitted directly into consciousness through methods that bypassed normal sensory processing. The message was simple, elegant, and absolutely terrifying. Phase 2 initiating. Selected individuals prepare for interface protocols. Dr. Chen stared at her screens for hours, trying to process the implications of what she'd intercepted. The electromagnetic monitoring that Dr. Petrov's network had discovered wasn't just passive surveillance. It had been preparation for active communication with specific humans who had been identified during the evaluation process. She wasn't the only one receiving signals. Within hours, similar transmissions were being detected by Witnesses Network members around the world. Astronomers in Chile, physicists in Japan, researchers in Canada, all reporting identical 17-second bursts containing the same impossible information densities. But the signals weren't being sent to everyone. The recipients formed a specific profile: scientists working on consciousness research, individuals who had demonstrated unusual empathy and cooperative behavior, people who had been documenting extraterrestrial encounters despite professional and personal risks. It was as if the extraterrestrial intelligence had compiled a contact list of humans they considered suitable for whatever came next, and they were now beginning the process of direct communication with those individuals. Dr. Chen called Dr. Petrov immediately, her hands shaking as she dialed the number through encrypted channels the Witnesses Network had established for emergency communications. When he answered, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been expecting this call for years. "It's starting, isn't it?" he said before she could speak. "The signal came through at 0347 GMT, she replied. 17 seconds of structured data transmission on frequencies that shouldn't be physically possible. And Yuri, I think I understand part of what they're trying to tell us. Tell me. They're not planning mass contact. They're not preparing for public disclosure. They're selecting specific individuals for direct communication, people who demonstrated capacity for handling contact without the aggression and fear that characterized government responses during the Cold War." There was a long pause before Dr. Petrov responded. "Elena, we need to understand something. If they're making selective contact, if they're bypassing governments and institutions entirely, then they've already reached their verdict about humanity as a whole. They're not trying to save our species. They're trying to save specific individuals from whatever consequences our species has earned." The implication hit Dr. Chen like a physical blow. The selective monitoring, the careful evaluation of individual humans, the preparation for interface protocols with chosen recipients. It wasn't preparation for humanity's integration into a galactic community. It was preparation for evacuation of selected individuals before something catastrophic happened to everyone else. "How many of us are there?" she asked quietly. "Based on the network reports we've received, maybe 10,000 individuals worldwide have received similar signals. Out of a global population of over 7 billion, that's not integration, that's salvage." Dr. Chen closed her eyes and tried to process the enormity of what they were facing. The extraterrestrial intelligence hadn't been evaluating humanity to determine whether the species deserved contact. They had been evaluating individual humans to determine who might be worth preserving when the species faced the consequences of choices made by their governments decades earlier. The message that had been transmitted to Soviet facilities in 1988: "Your species has chosen hostility." This choice will be remembered. Hadn't been a warning. It had been a verdict. And the systematic monitoring that followed hadn't been continued evaluation. It had been the selection process for individuals who would be offered escape from whatever judgment awaited the rest of humanity. "What do we do?" she whispered into the encrypted phone. "We prepare for interface protocols," Dr. Petrov replied. "Because whether we like it or not, we've become humanity's representatives in whatever comes next. Not by choice, not by election, but by demonstrating the capacity for growth beyond the patterns that doomed our species." Over the following weeks, the selected individuals began reporting strange experiences. Dreams that felt more real than waking consciousness, filled with imagery of vast spaces between stars and civilizations that spanned galaxies. Moments of enhanced awareness where complex scientific concepts suddenly became clear without study or explanation. Episodes of what could only be described as telepathic communication with intelligence that felt ancient, patient, and profoundly sad. The interface protocols weren't traumatic or invasive. They felt more like gentle education, as if the extraterrestrial intelligence was slowly preparing selected humans for realities that their normal consciousness couldn't process without extensive conditioning. Dr. Chen found herself understanding principles of physics that human science hadn't discovered, seeing mathematical relationships that described the structure of reality in ways that made Einstein's theories seem like elementary arithmetic. But the knowledge came with emotional context that was almost overwhelming. She could sense the disappointment of intelligence that had hoped humanity would choose differently when first offered extraterrestrial technology. The sadness of observers who had watched species after species make similar choices, choosing fear and aggression over curiosity and cooperation when faced with evidence of their cosmic insignificance. But she could also sense something else: determination. The extraterrestrial intelligence had decided that individual consciousness was worth preserving even when collective consciousness had failed. They were willing to invest enormous resources in saving representatives of a failed species because consciousness itself, regardless of its biological origin, was precious in a universe where intelligence was rare and fragile. The interface protocols continued for months, gradually expanding the awareness of selected individuals until they could begin to comprehend the scope of what they were being offered. Not just escape from Earth, but integration into a galactic community of consciousness that spanned thousands of worlds and millions of years of cooperative development. But the offer came with conditions that were both generous and heartbreaking. The selected individuals could join this cosmic community, but they would be leaving behind a world that had chosen isolation through hostility. Earth would be quarantined, cut off from contact with galactic civilization until its dominant species either evolved beyond aggression or eliminated itself through the same violence that had characterized first contact. Dr. Chen realized she was facing the most important decision in human history, not just for herself, but as a representative of everything humanity might have become under different circumstances. Accept the offer and preserve human consciousness in a form that could grow and develop among the stars, or refuse and remain with a species that had already been judged unworthy of cosmic citizenship. The choice was made more agonizing by the knowledge that both options represented forms of death for humanity as it had existed. Accept the offer, and human civilization on Earth would lose its best representatives to cosmic exile. Refuse, and those representatives would be trapped with a species facing consequences that might include complete extinction. But as the interface protocols deepened and her understanding expanded, Dr. Chen began to see a third possibility. The extraterrestrial intelligence wasn't just offering escape or exile. They were offering transformation, the opportunity to become something greater than human, while retaining the essential consciousness that made humanity worth preserving. The selected individuals wouldn't just be joining an existing galactic community. They would be carrying human consciousness into that community, adding human perspectives and experiences to a cosmic dialogue that had been ongoing for millions of years. They would become ambassadors not just for themselves, but for the potential that humanity had demonstrated despite the failures of its collective institutions. It was a form of immortality, but not for individual humans. It was immortality for human consciousness itself, preserved and transmitted into a future where it could grow beyond the limitations that had trapped it on a single world with a species that had chosen fear over wonder. As she sat in her laboratory, surrounded by instruments that could detect signals from across the galaxy, but couldn't prevent the tragedy unfolding on her own world, Dr. Chen understood that she was witnessing the end of one chapter in human history and the beginning of another. The Cold War had been humanity's first test in cosmic diplomacy, and the species had failed. But individual humans had passed a different test, demonstrating that consciousness could transcend the limitations of its biological and cultural origins. And that consciousness would survive, even if the civilization that had produced it did not. The stars were calling, offering sanctuary to minds that had proven themselves capable of growth beyond aggression and fear. But accepting that offer meant acknowledging that humanity as a species had already chosen its fate through actions taken in secret facilities decades earlier. The interface protocols continued, preparing selected individuals for a transition that would preserve the best of human consciousness, while leaving behind the worst of human civilization. It was salvation and tragedy combined into a single moment of cosmic significance. And somewhere in the darkness between worlds, ancient intelligence watched and waited as individual humans made choices that would determine not just their own fate, but the ultimate legacy of a species that had briefly touched the stars before choosing to retreat into the shadows of its own fear and aggression. The universe was vast, patient, and full of consciousness that had learned to transcend the limitations of its origins. Human consciousness was about to join that cosmic community, carried by individuals who had demonstrated that growth beyond violence was possible even for a species that had chosen war as its response to wonder. But the price of that transcendence was saying goodbye to a world that had already chosen its own path through the darkness between the stars. And that goodbye was approaching faster than anyone on Earth realized, measured in electromagnetic pulses that carried final preparations for a transition that would echo through cosmic history as both humanity's greatest failure and its most profound redemption. The choice had been made decades earlier in secret facilities buried beneath frozen Earth. Now individual humans were living with the consequences of that choice, offered salvation they had never asked for from a tragedy they had never been told was coming, and in the quiet moments between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the ordinary concerns of daily life, selected individuals could feel the universe calling them home to a community of consciousness they had never known existed, but had always been meant to join. The stars were waiting. The question was whether humanity's representatives were ready to answer a call that would transform them into something greater than human, while preserving everything that had made humanity worth saving in the first place. Time was running out, measured not in years or decades, but in the patient breathing of cosmic intelligence that had waited long enough for a species to choose between fear and wonder, between isolation and connection, between the death of consciousness, trapped by violence, and the immortality of awareness, freed to explore the infinite mysteries of existence among the stars. The interface protocols were nearly complete. Soon, the choice would have to be made, and whatever decision the selected individuals reached would determine whether human consciousness had a future among the stars, or would remain forever trapped in the darkness of a world that had chosen hostility over hope. When offered the greatest gift in cosmic history, the universe was listening. The answer would determine not just individual fates, but the ultimate meaning of a species that had briefly glimpsed infinity before choosing to look away into the comfortable shadows of its own limitations and fears. And in that choice lay both the tragedy and the transcendence of human consciousness, encountering intelligence that spanned the cosmos with patience, wisdom, and a sadness born from watching species after species make similar decisions when offered the stars. The Cold War was over, but humanity's cosmic trial was reaching its final verdict, and that verdict would be written not in the halls of power or the chambers of government, but in the hearts and minds of individuals who had been chosen to carry human consciousness into a future that stretched beyond imagination, into the infinite community of awareness that called the universe home. The final phase began not with fanfare or global announcements, but with whispers in the dark corners of the internet. Former military personnel started speaking at conferences they never would have attended before. Scientists published papers that referenced phenomena their institutions had denied for decades. Government officials made statements that would have ended careers just years earlier. Dr. Chen watched this unfold with growing unease. The gradual disclosure wasn't happening by accident or because of changing political attitudes. It was being orchestrated by intelligence that operated on timescales measured in centuries, not election cycles. Each revelation was carefully timed, each witness strategically positioned, each document released with surgical precision to prepare humanity for something far more significant than government transparency. The selected individuals could feel it building. The interface protocols had evolved beyond simple communication into something approaching symbiosis. They found themselves understanding complex scientific principles without study, seeing mathematical relationships that described reality in ways human education had never approached, experiencing moments of awareness that felt both alien and profoundly familiar. But with that expanded consciousness came terrible clarity about what was actually happening to Earth. The electromagnetic monitoring hadn't stopped when the signals began. It had intensified, focusing now on global communication networks, financial systems, military installations, and population centers. The extraterrestrial intelligence wasn't just evaluating anymore. They were mapping, cataloging, preparing for something that required detailed knowledge of human civilization's infrastructure and capabilities. Dr. Petrov had been analyzing the patterns for weeks when he made a discovery that changed everything. The monitoring wasn't random surveillance or scientific curiosity. It was preparation for systematic intervention. The extraterrestrial intelligence had concluded their evaluation of humanity and reached a verdict that required active management of the species' development. The evidence was hidden in the data streams that flowed between the monitoring stations and whatever processing centers existed beyond Earth's atmosphere. Communication protocols that suggested coordination between multiple civilizations, resource allocation discussions that treated Earth like a problem requiring solution, and temporal scheduling that indicated major changes were planned for specific dates in the near future. "They're not here to save us," Dr. Petrov told the Emergency Gathering of Witnesses network coordinators. "They're here to manage us. Humanity failed the test, but complete extinction would waste the potential they've identified in selected individuals, so they're implementing what they call a conservation protocol." The term sent chills through everyone in the encrypted video conference. Conservation implied preservation, but not in the way any human would want to be preserved. It suggested humanity was being treated like an endangered species that required careful management to prevent complete loss of genetic or cultural material. Dr. Chen had been dreading this moment since the first interface protocol began. What does conservation mean in practical terms? What are they planning to do with the rest of humanity? Dr. Petrov's expression was grim. Based on the communication patterns I've analyzed, they're planning to implement what they call developmental restrictions. Humanity will be prevented from advancing technologically beyond certain limits until the species demonstrates improved behavioral patterns. No interstellar travel, no advanced artificial intelligence, no weapons systems beyond current capabilities. "That's imprisonment," someone said from the conference feed. "They're turning Earth into a cosmic prison." "No," Dr. Petrov corrected quietly. "They're turning Earth into a nursery, a controlled environment where humanity can continue to exist while they determine whether the species can eventually mature beyond its current limitations. The selected individuals aren't being evacuated. We're being prepared to serve as intermediaries between human civilization and galactic administration." The implications were staggering. The interface protocols hadn't been preparation for escape or transcendence. They had been preparation for service as translators, administrators, and overseers in a system that would manage human development from the shadows. The selected individuals would become humanity's handlers, implementing policies decided by intelligence that viewed the species as a management problem requiring long-term supervision. Dr. Chen felt the weight of cosmic irony crushing down on her. She had been chosen not for her potential to transcend humanity, but for her capacity to help control it. The extraterrestrial intelligence had identified individuals who could bridge the gap between human consciousness and galactic administration, people who could help implement restrictions and limitations that would prevent humanity from repeating the mistakes that had led to this situation. "When?" she asked simply. "The communication patterns suggest implementation within the next 18 months, Dr. Petrov replied. "They're coordinating with other civilizations that have experience managing species that failed initial contact protocols. Earth is becoming a case study in cosmic social work." The room fell silent as the assembled witnesses processed the magnitude of what they were facing. The age of human independence was ending, not through conquest or destruction, but through administrative intervention by intelligence that viewed violent species as a form of cosmic pollution requiring cleanup. But Dr. Chen had noticed something in her recent interface experiences that suggested the situation might be even more complex than Dr. Petrov realized. The extraterrestrial intelligence wasn't monolithic. There were disagreements, debates, different factions with different opinions about how humanity should be handled. Some advocated for the conservation protocol Dr. Petrov had discovered. Others pushed for more aggressive intervention, arguing that violent species required stronger controls to prevent them from eventually threatening galactic civilization. But a third faction seemed to believe that humanity still had potential for genuine development if given appropriate guidance rather than restriction. The interface protocols had been showing her fragments of these debates, cosmic council sessions where representatives of dozens of civilizations discussed humanity's fate with the detached professionalism of administrators handling a difficult case. Earth wasn't unique. Hundreds of species had faced similar evaluations, and the outcomes varied depending on which faction's recommendations were ultimately implemented. There might be another option, Dr. Chen said carefully. The intelligence communicating with us isn't unified in their approach. Some of them believe humanity can still develop beyond its current limitations if given proper guidance. The conservation protocol isn't the only possibility being considered. Dr. Petrov leaned forward intently. What are you seeing in your interface sessions that I'm not picking up in the communication intercepts? Debate, disagreement, politics, if that's the right word for it. The decision about humanity's future hasn't been finalized. Different civilizations have different opinions about what should be done with species that fail initial contact protocols. We might have more influence over the outcome than we realize. The possibility that humanity's fate was still being decided, rather than simply implemented, changed everything. The selected individuals weren't just being prepared to serve as administrators of cosmic policy. They were being prepared to serve as advocates, representatives who could argue for their species' potential in forums where such arguments might actually matter. But advocacy required understanding not just human potential, but galactic politics. The interface protocols began shifting, providing the selected individuals with information about the civilizations that would be deciding humanity's fate. Ancient cultures that had transcended violence millions of years earlier, younger species that had successfully navigated first contact, and failed civilizations that served as cautionary examples of what happened when developmental guidance was insufficient. Dr. Chen found herself learning about cosmic sociology, galactic law, and interspecies relations that spanned geological ages. But the knowledge came with emotional weight that was almost unbearable. She could sense the sadness of civilizations that had watched thousands of species make similar choices, the frustration of intelligence that wanted to help but had learned that forced development rarely succeeded, and the quiet determination of those who refused to give up on consciousness, regardless of how many times it disappointed them. The universe wasn't empty or hostile. It was full of intelligence that cared deeply about the development of consciousness, but had learned through bitter experience that caring wasn't enough. Species had to choose growth, choose cooperation, choose transcendence of their primitive impulses. And most species, when faced with that choice, chose fear instead. Humanity was just the latest in a long line of civilizations that had reached the threshold of cosmic citizenship and turned away. But the selected individuals represented something that gave the galaxy's older civilizations hope. Proof that consciousness could transcend its origins, even when the collective couldn't. The debate about humanity's future wasn't just about management policies or conservation protocols. It was about whether individual consciousness could be preserved and developed even when collective consciousness had failed. Whether the galaxy should invest resources in nurturing potential that might never be realized, or write off another failed species and focus on those with better prospects. Dr. Chen realized she and the other selected individuals were being prepared not just as intermediaries or advocates, but as living proof that human consciousness was worth preserving. Their development during the interface protocols would be evidence presented to galactic councils when humanity's fate was finally decided. The pressure was enormous, not just their own futures, but the future of their entire species depended on how well they could demonstrate humanity's potential for growth beyond the violence and fear that had characterized first contact. They were representing not just themselves, but everyone they had ever known, everyone they had ever loved, everyone who would ever be born on Earth. But they were also carrying hope for intelligence throughout the galaxy that had invested millions of years in nurturing consciousness wherever it appeared. Success would validate their faith in the potential of awareness to transcend its limitations. Failure would add humanity to the long list of species that had chosen isolation over integration, fear over wonder, violence over the infinite possibilities that awaited among the stars. The interface protocols intensified, preparing the selected individuals for appearances before cosmic councils, where their words and actions would determine whether Earth became a managed preserve for failed consciousness, or received another chance to choose its own path toward the stars. Time was running out, but not in the way anyone had expected. The universe was patient, but galactic resources weren't infinite. Soon, decisions would have to be made about how much energy and attention to invest in a species that had already demonstrated its preference for hostility over hope. The selected individuals would speak for humanity in forums where the fate of civilizations was decided with the same careful deliberation that human administrators might use to manage endangered species. But they would be speaking for more than just their own planet. They would be representing the possibility that consciousness could grow beyond its origins, that awareness could transcend the fear and violence that had characterized its early development. The stars were listening, waiting to hear whether humanity's representatives could offer compelling reasons why their species deserved another chance at cosmic citizenship. The answer would echo through galactic history as either humanity's redemption or its final failure to recognize that the universe was full of intelligence, willing to help those who chose to grow beyond the limitations of their origins. And in the quiet moments between interface sessions, Dr. Chen and the others could feel the weight of cosmic history pressing down on them. They were no longer just human beings trying to understand strange experiences. They had become humanity's last hope for a future among the stars, carrying the dreams and potential of an entire species into councils where such dreams were either nurtured into reality or filed away with the countless other civilizations that had chosen fear over the infinite wonder of cosmic consciousness. The trial was approaching its final phase, but the verdict was still unwritten, and in that uncertainty lay both humanity's greatest danger and its last remaining hope for transcendence beyond the violence and isolation that had defined its first encounter with intelligence that spanned the cosmos with patience, wisdom, and an infinite capacity for both disappointment and hope. The universe was waiting for humanity's final answer to the question that had been posed decades earlier in secret facilities buried beneath frozen Earth. The response would determine not just the fate of one small planet, but the future of consciousness itself in a cosmos where awareness was precious, fragile, and worth preserving, even when it emerged from species that had forgotten how to dream of anything greater than their own fears and limitations. The final deliberation began in chambers that existed between dimensions, in spaces where matter and energy danced to laws that human physics had never imagined. Dr. Chen found herself there not through physical travel, but through consciousness that had been gradually expanded until it could perceive realities beyond the electromagnetic spectrum that defined human experience. She wasn't alone. Around her, or perhaps through her, were the other selected individuals from Earth. But they weren't the humans they had been months earlier. The interface protocols had changed them, expanded their awareness, until they could participate in discussions that spanned multiple levels of reality simultaneously. The cosmic council that would decide humanity's fate wasn't what she had expected. There were no alien beings sitting around conference tables, no dramatic speeches or formal presentations. Instead, there was a form of communication that transcended language, where thoughts and intentions merged into collective understanding that included the perspectives of civilizations separated by millions of years of development. Dr. Chen could sense the presence of intelligence that had witnessed the birth and death of galaxies, consciousness that had observed the rise and fall of thousands of species, awareness that carried the accumulated wisdom of cosmic ages. But she could also feel something more immediate and personal, genuine concern for the outcome of humanity's evaluation. The debate wasn't conducted through words or even concepts as humans understood them. It was a flow of understanding that included emotional context, historical precedent, and predictive modeling that stretched across possible futures. Dr. Chen found herself experiencing the perspectives of multiple civilizations simultaneously, seeing humanity through eyes that had watched similar species make identical choices throughout galactic history. The pattern was depressingly consistent. Species developed technology, encountered evidence of intelligence beyond their world, and responded with fear, aggression, and attempts at weaponization. Most never progressed beyond that initial failure. They remained trapped on their birth worlds, managed from a distance, prevented from spreading their violence to other systems until they either matured or eliminated themselves through the same hostility that had characterized their first cosmic contact. But there were exceptions. Civilizations that had recognized their mistakes, chosen different paths, transcended their primitive impulses, and joined the galactic community as contributing members rather than managed subjects. The question facing the Council was whether humanity showed signs of similar potential, or represented another case requiring permanent oversight. The evidence was mixed. Human governments had demonstrated exactly the patterns that predicted failure: secrecy, aggression, attempts to weaponize what they couldn't understand. But individual humans had shown capacity for growth, empathy, cooperation, and the kind of intellectual curiosity that suggested potential for genuine development. Dr. Chen realized she was experiencing the debate from multiple perspectives simultaneously. She could feel the disappointment of civilizations that had hoped for different choices, the frustration of intelligence that wanted to help but had learned that forced development rarely succeeded, and the quiet determination of those who refused to abandon consciousness regardless of how many times it disappointed them. But she could also sense something else: the weight of precedent. Every decision made about humanity would influence how future species were handled. If exceptions were made, if resources were invested in guidance rather than management, the outcomes would affect cosmic policy for millions of years. The Council wasn't just deciding humanity's fate, they were establishing principles that would guide galactic civilization's approach to emerging consciousness throughout the universe. The responsibility was staggering. Dr. Chen and the other selected individuals weren't just representing their own species. They were representing the possibility that consciousness could transcend its origins, that intelligence could grow beyond the fear and violence that characterized its early development. Their success or failure would influence how the galaxy approached every future civilization that reached the threshold of cosmic awareness. The debate continued for what felt like years, but might have been moments in normal time. Dr. Chen experienced scenarios, possibilities, potential futures that stretched across millennia. She saw versions of Earth under different management protocols, humanity developing along various paths depending on how much guidance and restriction were applied. Some futures were encouraging. Humanity gradually learning to transcend its aggressive impulses, eventually earning the right to join galactic civilization as full participants. Others were tragic. Earth becoming a managed preserve where humans lived comfortable but limited lives, never knowing what they might have become if they had chosen differently during first contact. But the most disturbing possibilities were those where management failed entirely. Scenarios where restrictions bred resentment, where oversight created rebellion, where attempts at guidance resulted in species that became even more violent and unpredictable than they had been originally. The galaxy was haunted by civilizations that had been driven to madness by well-intentioned but misapplied developmental policies. Dr. Chen began to understand the true complexity of what the Council faced. There were no perfect solutions, no policies that guaranteed positive outcomes. Every choice carried risks. Every approach had failed with some species while succeeding with others. The Council wasn't debating between good and bad options. They were trying to choose between different forms of uncertainty. But gradually, consensus began to emerge from the flowing discussion. Not agreement about what should be done, but recognition of what needed to be tested. Humanity would be given a conditional opportunity, a chance to demonstrate whether the potential identified in selected individuals could spread to the species as a whole. The terms were unlike anything Dr. Chen had expected. Instead of management or restriction, humanity would receive guidance, not the kind of heavy-handed oversight that had failed with other species, but subtle influence designed to encourage better choices without removing the freedom to make wrong ones. The selected individuals would return to Earth changed by their experience, carrying knowledge and perspectives that would gradually spread through human civilization. Not through dramatic revelations or forced enlightenment, but through the natural influence that expanded consciousness had on those around it. It would be a slow process, measured in generations rather than years. But it offered something that management protocols couldn't provide: the possibility of genuine growth rather than imposed development. Humanity would have the chance to choose its own path toward cosmic citizenship, guided by those who had already begun the journey, but not forced to follow any specific route. The risks were enormous. Without direct management, humanity might choose even worse paths than it had originally. The guidance might be rejected. The expanded consciousness of selected individuals might be dismissed or suppressed. The species might retreat even further into isolation and violence. But the potential rewards were equally significant. If humanity could transcend its limitations through choice rather than coercion, it would provide proof that consciousness could grow beyond its origins, even in species that had initially chosen fear over wonder. Success would validate the galaxy's faith in the possibility of redemption. Failure would add another lesson to the accumulated wisdom about what didn't work in cosmic development. Dr. Chen felt the weight of the decisions settling around her like a physical presence. She and the other selected individuals were being entrusted not just with their own futures, but with an experiment that would influence galactic policy for millions of years. They would return to Earth, carrying responsibility for their species' development that no human government had ever imagined. But they wouldn't be returning alone. The interface protocols had created connections between human consciousness and galactic intelligence that would persist indefinitely. The selected individuals would remain linked to the cosmic community, able to access guidance and wisdom when faced with decisions that exceeded human understanding. It was a form of membership in galactic civilization, but not the kind that had been anticipated. Instead of humanity joining as a species, selected individuals would serve as bridges between human consciousness and cosmic intelligence. They would carry galactic perspectives into human civilization, while representing human potential in cosmic forums. The arrangement was unprecedented in galactic history. Usually, Species either joined the cosmic community as complete civilizations or remained permanently isolated until they achieved independent transcendence. The hybrid approach being offered to humanity reflected both the promise and the problems the species had demonstrated. As the Council's decision crystallized into final form, Dr. Chen experienced something that might have been relief mixed with terror. Humanity had been given another chance, but the conditions for success were more demanding than any previous test. The species would have to choose growth, not because it was forced upon them, but because individuals throughout human civilization gradually recognized that growth was possible. The selected individuals would be seeds of expanded consciousness planted throughout human society. Whether those seeds grew into transformation or were rejected by a species too frightened to change remained to be seen. The outcome would determine not just humanity's future, but the future of cosmic policy toward emerging civilizations throughout the universe. Dr. Chen began to sense the council session ending, her consciousness gradually contracting back toward the human perspective she had left behind months earlier. But she wasn't returning unchanged. The knowledge, the connections, the expanded awareness that had developed during the interface protocols would remain, integrated into her normal consciousness in ways that would influence every decision she made for the rest of her life. As she felt herself transitioning back to ordinary reality, back to her laboratory and her instruments and her human concerns, she carried with her the weight of cosmic responsibility and the fragile hope that her species might still choose to grow beyond the fear and violence that had defined its first encounter with intelligence that spanned the stars. The trial was over, but the real test was just beginning. Humanity had been given the rarest of gifts, a second chance to choose its path toward the cosmos. Whether that gift would be recognized, accepted, and transformed into genuine growth remained the greatest question in human history. And the answer would be written not in government facilities or secret archives, but in the daily choices of ordinary people who might never know they were participating in the most important experiment in galactic civilization's approach to emerging consciousness. The universe was watching, waiting, hoping that this time the choice would be different. That consciousness could transcend its origins through wisdom rather than force, through recognition rather than coercion, through the gradual awakening of a species to its own potential for growth beyond the limitations that had trapped it in cycles of fear and violence since its first glimpse of the infinite community of awareness that called the cosmos home. The Cold War was over. The secret facilities were empty. The classified documents were becoming historical curiosities. But the real story of humanity's encounter with extraterrestrial intelligence was just beginning, written in the expanding consciousness of individuals who had been chosen to carry their species' future into a universe full of intelligence, waiting to see whether this time, finally, the choice would be growth instead of fear. The stars were calling, patient as always, infinite in their capacity for both disappointment and hope. And somewhere between Earth and the cosmic community that awaited among distant suns, human consciousness was preparing to make the most important choice in its history, whether to transcend the violence that had defined first contact and accept the guidance that could lead to genuine membership among the civilizations that had learned to make the universe home. The answer would echo through cosmic history, but it would be written in the quiet moments when ordinary humans chose cooperation over conflict, curiosity over fear, growth over the comfortable limitations that had kept their species trapped in isolation since the first UFO crashed into frozen Earth, and governments chose secrecy over the wonder that could have transformed human civilization into something worthy of the stars. Time was running out, but not in the way anyone expected. The universe had all the time in existence, but human consciousness was at a crossroads that would determine whether it had any future worth measuring in cosmic terms. The choice had to be made by individuals who might never know the stakes, guided by those who carried the weight of galactic hope, in their expanded awareness of what consciousness could become when it chose to grow beyond the fear that had defined its origins. The bedtime story was ending, but the real adventure was just beginning, and whether it would be a tale of transcendence or tragedy depended on choices that were being made right now, in the quiet moments between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the ordinary concerns of daily life, and the infinite possibilities that awaited among the stars. The story ends where it began, in silence. Not the silence of empty space, but the silence of infinite possibility waiting to be born. Dr. Chen returned to her laboratory, but she was no longer the same person who had first detected those impossible signals months earlier. The interface protocols had changed her in ways that went beyond knowledge or expanded awareness. She carried within her consciousness a living connection to intelligence that spanned galaxies, a bridge between human limitations and cosmic potential that would never fully close. The other selected individuals faced similar transformations. They returned to their ordinary lives as teachers, researchers, engineers, artists. But each carried seeds of expanded consciousness that would gradually influence everyone they encountered. Not through dramatic revelations or mystical experiences, but through the subtle influence that wisdom has on those ready to receive it. They became humanity's quiet ambassadors to itself. In classrooms where physics was taught with just a hint of deeper mysteries. In laboratories where research questions began reaching toward principles that human science was only beginning to suspect. In conversations where the possibility of broader perspectives crept naturally into discussions about humanity's place in the universe. The changes were so gradual that most people never noticed they were happening. A shift in perspective here, a moment of expanded awareness there. Scientists began asking different questions. Artists began expressing visions that seemed to come from beyond human experience. Engineers started designing systems that reached toward possibilities their textbooks had never mentioned. It was transformation through inspiration rather than information. The selected individuals had learned that consciousness couldn't be forced to grow, but it could be invited to recognize its own potential for expansion beyond the boundaries that fear had created. The cosmic community watched with the patient attention of intelligence that had seen similar experiments succeed and fail across millions of years. They had offered humanity the rarest gift in galactic history: guidance without coercion, wisdom without dominance, the chance to choose transcendence through recognition of its own deeper nature. But the outcome remained uncertain. For every moment of expanded awareness, there were still choices toward fear, violence, and isolation. Humanity was suspended between possibilities, balanced on the edge between growth and regression, between joining the cosmic community and remaining trapped in the limitations that had defined its response to first contact. The secret archives that had contained evidence of humanity's first encounter with extraterrestrial intelligence became footnotes in a larger story that was still being written. The Cold War documents, the classified testimonies, the buried reports of impossible technology, all of it became historical curiosity compared to the quiet revolution in consciousness that was spreading through human civilization like ripples in a cosmic pond. Dr. Petrov found himself teaching courses that explored the intersection of consciousness and physics, introducing concepts that prepared students for realities their predecessors couldn't have imagined. He never mentioned the interface protocols or the Cosmic Council, but his lectures carried undertones of broader possibilities that inspired some students to ask questions that pushed the boundaries of human understanding. Dr. Chen discovered that her research into electromagnetic phenomena had taken on new dimensions. She was detecting patterns in cosmic background radiation that suggested structures and communications spanning galactic distances. But instead of publishing papers that would have seemed impossible just years earlier, she guided younger researchers toward discoveries that would gradually expand humanity's awareness of its cosmic context. Across the world, The selected individuals found themselves becoming catalysts for transformation they could never have imagined when they first received those 17-second signals. They were living bridges between human consciousness and galactic intelligence, carrying cosmic perspectives into earthly concerns while representing human potential in forums that existed beyond ordinary perception. The experiment was working, slowly and subtly. Human consciousness was beginning to recognize its own capacity for growth beyond the fear and aggression that had characterized first contact. Not through dramatic revelations or forced enlightenment, but through the natural evolution of awareness when given proper guidance and the freedom to choose its own path. But the process was fragile. Every day brought choices that could reinforce growth or return to patterns of isolation and hostility. The selected individuals carried not just hope, but responsibility for nurturing developments that could either transform human civilization or collapse back into the same cycles of violence that had nearly doomed the species during its first encounter with cosmic intelligence. They had become gardeners of consciousness, tending seeds of expanded awareness in the soil of human civilization. Some seeds would grow into trees that reached toward the stars. Others would wither in ground too poisoned by fear to support transcendence. The ratio of growth to failure would determine whether humanity passed this second, subtler test of its worthiness for cosmic citizenship. As years passed, the changes became more visible. Scientific discoveries that seemed to leap beyond previous understanding. Artistic expressions that captured visions of realities beyond human experience. Technological developments that reached toward principles the textbooks were only beginning to acknowledge. Philosophical insights that prepared human consciousness for recognition of its place in a universe full of intelligence and wonder. The transformation was happening, but it remained uncertain whether it was happening quickly enough or comprehensively enough to satisfy the cosmic community's requirements for full acceptance. The guidance was there. The connections were established, the potential was being realized. But potential was not the same as achievement, and the galactic councils would ultimately judge humanity by its collective choices rather than the accomplishments of selected individuals. Dr. Chen often found herself standing outside at night, looking up at stars that no longer seemed distant and cold, but warm with the presence of intelligence that had become part of her expanded awareness. She could sense the vast conversations happening between worlds, the flow of knowledge and wisdom that connected civilizations across impossible distances. The patient attention focused on her small planet as it struggled to choose between fear and wonder. Sometimes she received impressions of other worlds where similar experiments were taking place. Species at various stages of development, some succeeding in transcending their primitive impulses, others failing and retreating into isolation or self-destruction. Humanity was not unique in facing this choice, but each species had to make the decision for itself. The cosmic community could offer guidance, but not salvation. The responsibility remained with humanity itself, to recognize the gift that had been offered, to choose growth over stagnation, to transcend the fear and violence that had characterized its first glimpse of the infinite community of consciousness that filled the universe with purpose, meaning, and wonder beyond imagination. The bedtime story was ending, but the dream it had awakened was just beginning to unfold in the consciousness of a species that had been given one more chance to discover what it might become when it chose to grow beyond the limitations of its origins. Whether humanity would seize that chance or let it slip away remained the most important question in human history. The answer would be written not in secret facilities or government archives, but in the daily choices of ordinary people who carried within themselves the potential for transformation that could echo through cosmic history as either humanity's greatest achievement or its most profound tragedy. The stars were waiting, patient as always, infinite in their capacity for both hope and disappointment. And somewhere between Earth and the galactic community that existed among distant suns, human consciousness was slowly awakening to possibilities that had always existed, but had never been recognized until guided by intelligence that spanned the cosmos with wisdom, compassion, and an endless commitment to nurturing awareness, wherever it appeared in the vast darkness of space. The universe was full of consciousness, full of intelligence, full of wonder waiting to be discovered by species brave enough to choose growth over fear. Humanity had been invited to join that cosmic community, but the invitation could only be accepted through choices that transformed fear into curiosity, violence into cooperation, and isolation into recognition of the infinite connections that linked all consciousness across the reaches of space and time. The choice was being made now, in this moment, in the quiet spaces between thoughts where expanded awareness touched the edges of ordinary consciousness and whispered of possibilities that stretched beyond imagination toward realities that awaited among the stars. Sweet dreams. The universe is listening,